hello, everyone. I'd like to introduce to you my daughter, Krista. She got into the disability ministry by doing an internship at her campus this last summer, researching disability and theology. And so from this, a lot of things have emerged. And I'll let you go now, Krista.
Wait, Okay, cool. That was really brief. Smooth. Yeah, let me just share my PowerPoint. Yeep. Hold on, I'm a functional being, I promise. It's only like noon. Anyway, yeah, my little presentation. So for this, I wanted to present a little bit about part of the UCC's program, which is A2A, which is more of the disability and connecting disability supports with the church. Yeah, so I wanted to highlight that a little bit. So before we start, I want, during this whole presentation, I want you to think about a few questions, which is, one, are persons with disabilities welcome to worship with us, like physically, but also emotionally? Are there members that don't have apparent disabilities? Do we recognize the gifts and talents of people with disabilities? And are they involved in the life of the congregation as much as they want to be? Are people with disabilities given opportunities to serve with others within the congregation and outreach programs? And are positions of leadership offered to individuals that happen to have a disability? Just a few fun questions to think about. I know we're pretty far into this. We try and be inclusive, but there are, these are kind of the bare necessities, the bare things. But yeah, we're kind of a little more advanced than this, but it's always a nice place to start. Yeah. So I wanted to include a little info about disability history, just in general, because no one really knows about it. It's not really taught in schools or in general in life, no one knows. First of all, I want to define disability. It is a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Yeah, so that's the legal definition. And it includes more people than you'd think. And so a little bit about the modern disability movement, which actually helps start up the A2A, and actually UCC was heavily involved in the disability movement. So first of all, it all started say the early, was it 1900s with basically there was 1800s, start of America. There was a lot of home care. I'm not going to go any further back, but there was a lot of home care. So the person with disability would live with their family member. Live with their family members for their whole life. And basically the family and the community would support them. And then institutions started becoming a thing, and there started to become a lot more stigma, and you would basically just put your kid in an institution because it's just easier, and they would get more supports. And then the late 60s, mid 60s, JFK, who actually had a sister with a disability, announced his plan to deinstitutionalize people with disabilities because his whole family was very opposed to that and pushed very hard to keep his sister out of institutions. And so basically this started this whole shockwave of bringing people out from these institutions into the wider community, which hadn't been done in many years. And it was absolutely chaotic mess. And so we have a protest that happened through the 70s through the 90s, which were kind of a big deal. These people are crawling up the steps of the Capitol because there was no ramp, and just to prove the inaccessibility. And this was in the 1900s. But also the church kind of played a role in this. So this fellow here, Reverend Howard Wyke, is he's basically receiving the pen from the signing of the ADA, and he was a reverend at a UCC church, and he spent a lot of his life focusing on trying to make churches accessible and keeping the space, open for everyone. And so a lot of the HA things I'm going to talk about, Howard Wyke started himself, and he grew, and I kind of want to keep his legacy going at our church and keep it accessible multiple ways. As a fun fact, churches don't actually have to be ADA accessible at all. So so anything we do is kind of a step up for us. But that is a kind of a big just hurdle in general, but I wanted to mention that a little bit. Yeah. And so I also wanted to talk about what is a disability, because I'm guessing you guys know, maybe most people in this room don't identify as a person with a disability. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Yep. I might actually have a disability. So a lot of these are, mobility, just anything. Can you like not walk as well as other people can? Blindness or visual impairment and deafness are kind of what we think of as the standard disabilities, that and the mobility, I use a wheelchair. And so there's also hearing loss. Hearing loss is different than deafness. Hearing loss is anyone who was not born hearing. It was born hearing, but lost their hearing over time. Very important distinction, just important life things. Don't call a deaf person a person with hearing loss, and don't call a person with hearing loss deaf. Sensory disabilities is a really big one that we aren't aware of a lot of times. So a person might be very sensitive to light, or loud noises might like just be the most horrible thing in the world for them. Specifically a lot of the HA programs, they highlight hearing, hearing and sound specifically disabilities, because it's a kind of a problem in a loud, echoey church. It might keep a lot of people with disabilities out of a church space, like having the organ play. So finding other accessible ways around that. And also people who might be sensitive to sense. This is one thing that I like, as I came across, is kind of a big thing, which is again another part of sensory. A lot of the HA things, they recommend that everything be unscented, just no matter whatever it is, the soap, no one wear perfume, no one wear anything, just because if a person with a smell disability may not be able to come to church specifically for that only reason. Chronic pain and chronic illness is also a big one. And we don't think a lot about that, but that is because it hinders your everyday life. And then we have a few more. I just wanted to mention them just because it's really important when thinking about disability, think about all of them. Neurodevelopmental disabilities, or IDD, basically anyone who has a more of a mental impairment. It happens from the brain. Learning disabilities that impact, reading, writing, makes it harder to read, harder to write. Traumatic brain injury and stroke, that is a disability because it hinders lifelong trying to do those everyday tasks. And also dementia and Alzheimer's, definitely a disability, because hinders their everyday life. And then mental health conditions. As you know, my mom works with WISE. And so A2A, which is this big program I'm going to talk a little bit about, was kind of the birthplace of WISE, because mental health conditions are a disability. And so WISE kind of broke off recently from their own group, basically to focus on supporting people with specifically mental health conditions. This A2A is a little more wider and focuses a lot more on everyone else, physical and mental. So another fun thing, I like to throw in lots of fun things because I'm like, while I'm here, and disability is not something a lot of people think about. You can have an accessible space, but it may not be an inclusive space. A lot of times these words come in play because of education. Just in general, a space can be an inclusive space, can be an accessible space, definitely not inclusive though. or vice versa. So accessible space is defined by Merriam-Webster as an easily used or accessed place by people with disabilities that is adapted specifically for people with disabilities, or is a place where a person with a disability can use it. And inclusive spaces are, yes, the practice or policy of providing equal opportunity and resources and supports to people who with disabilities who may have like a physical or mental disability. Oxford languages. So I also found some, I'm just kind of jumping around here. Don't mind me. I found there's actually only one study that has looked at people in the church, just in churches in general, all of the denominations, and explored like what people with disabilities think of churches. Like we all try and think of ourselves as being accessible and being a very inclusive space because we try. Most churches, the study found most churches do think so, like around like 90% think that they're pretty inclusive and accessible. But okay, so this is a study for people with disabilities and what they think, how accessible they find the space. So they find it adequate. Most people do, which means like they might have to like, there might be certain things that are like, oh, I don't see the ramp by the pulpit every day. I don't know if I would be able to get up there. So I'm just not going to go up there, but I can technically get into the service and I can be there and I can be present. And like, I may have to walk really far to get to the elevator, but technically I can go up a floor. And yeah, most people seem to think it's adequate. Some people think it's excellent, but this is talking a lot about physical spaces mostly. And so I found this really interesting one. My bad. This is a from the same study. This is out of Australia, actually. And it found basically, so this is what churches say they provide for people with disabilities. And so as you can see, there's a 5% mark here. Major facilities and minor physical facilities is like including things like accessible bathrooms, elevators. Most people have got that. The minor ones are for like the smaller churches. We have like elevators and stuff. So we would be in that 70%. A lot of times the big issue, especially, which is kind of why I'm mostly here, is we don't have a lot of program related provisions such as accessible Bibles or like programming that would be a little like, if you have like another version of like a program, especially like with kids things, that would be a little more accessible, or or just having accessible texts, or being like, hey, if you can't read this, here's this way you can get a digital one so you can still participate in our class, or just like things like that. Just adjusting the program, which is at program provisions, and only 5% of churches in all of Australia do that, and this is the only study they have. And only 20% say they're trying to foster a culture of inclusion, which I know we try and be, but it's really hard. And but mostly my thing is I'd like to do a little more program related provisions because we like, and because we have the physical aspects, which is getting people in the door, but it's not everything. And I also wanted to mention, so Howard White, the person back there, he has this famous quote he likes to say, which is, accessibility is not just a ramp. So it's not just having the elevator and the ramp. And he said this in like the 70s. And so I feel like we're going really far. I am really jumping around. I also wanted to talk about a little bit about disability theology, because I wouldn't be here if I didn't talk about a little bit of that, because I love that stuff. There is just, it's kind of another way of being accessible in a church, is just including people in our sermons. Like, I know we think about LGBTQ people and people of color when like someone's giving a sermon, and like we'll give shout outs to the struggles those minorities have. But also people with disabilities a lot of times aren't even heard in the pulpit. So like they're like, if a person identifies as disabled, they might just not see themselves in the Bible already, or see themselves in a negative light, or just not even hear themselves in the sermon, which is just kind of a one step to do things. Anyway, so disability theology is kind of a new thing. And so basically it's trying to like break those barriers and explore the Bible through the disabled lens, but also so highlighting some of like and acknowledging and talking about some of like the more negative aspects of the Bible, and how that impacts people with disabilities. Like we think of like the stories of healing the blind as something really positive, but a lot of times people who are blind struggle with that. They're like, I'm blind still. Is there something wrong with me because I'm blind and I'm not healed? And so talking about these things and having these conversations, or yeah, just in general, talking about healing, and how healing in the Bible is a little different than healing in real life, and acknowledging those things is kind of a big step. And so, yeah. And also, so there's this little figure here, the God in a chariot is basically, so I highly recommend this book. It's called The Disabled God. It's kind of the book that started this whole journey. I like to think it's a pretty good book. Eric's mentor has some strong opinions on it, but it's a pretty good basic book about disability theology. And basically it talks about the like thinking about God as like a disabled person, because like he doesn't, like we don't directly see them up in like heaven, and like actions that they might take, yeah, that he or them might take, he has to work through other people. And so I just had to throw this in. This is interpretation of the Bible. Yeah, while I'm here, the interpretation of the Bible is that he has to work through other people, so he's interdependent. Just like a lot of people with disabilities have to use caregivers or service workers to be interdependent. And so the idea that even if you need someone else to help you to live your everyday life, that doesn't mean that you're less of a person, because if God can do it and God does it, that means you're just as valid as well. So these are like newer interpretations and things that in the Bible that were just ways of validating and talking about people with disabilities experiences, that creates a little more inclusion just by acknowledging them and exploring these ideas. Anyway, so kind of my main part, which is A2A, which is accessibility and inclusion in our church, because we try, but there's more steps we can do. A2A is kind of this program I'm hoping that we can get introduced. Some of y'all could help me, that'd be wonderful. Yeah, so A2A, I've been talking with these people for a while, for about like 6 or so, what was that, 4 or so months. Started talking to them in the summer-ish. And yeah, they do the UCC disability ministries. And so their A2A program, which is accessible to all, basically is, yeah, just a label like the other ones are, that your church is fully accessible. But through that, you kind of have to fill out an accessibility checklist. It's a lot simpler than some of the other ones are. You kind of have to go around and explore the church. I'm hoping to just kind of explore the church my own when I get back, and measure things. And because a lot of things were like, yeah, this door can fit a wheelchair, and like it may be able to fit a wheelchair, but not enough to be like tight in there, or like maybe the sinks, some of the sinks are really high in our church. So thinking about that in ways that we can make it slightly more accessible that way, or just measuring things to double check, or like how heavy is the door, or can we just make sure that there is someone nearby this door if someone needs to open the door, or like keep it propped open if we have a heavy door, because we do have some really heavy doors. Or a one that I realized, like as I was looking through this checklist, that we don't have is our stairwells we try and keep them like preventing them from sliding, but like the stairs are pretty slick, and there's not a lot of lighting in them, and so that's kind of a big deal. So if a person wants to go down the stairs, like yeah, just making sure that it's completely accessible so someone would feel comfortable walking down the stairs if they needed to, yeah, and they wanted to. So yeah, I totally forgot to mention this, something really important. So a lot of we're probably like there's just not a lot of people with disabilities in our church, or there are people with disabilities, they keep coming. Why should we talk about accessibility? We have a physically accessible space already, don't we? A lot of times people with disabilities, even by showing representation and doing these steps before a person with a specific disability comes in, that if they do come in for a visit, then they see that the space is accessible to them and they're more comfortable staying in the church and wanting to keep coming back. And so by like doing these steps before we have a person with that specific disability there, might bring it's more supportive to the disability community or anyone who considers themselves to be part of the disability community with a specific disability, or if they don't identify as a disability but they just see it as a hindrance in their daily life. Yeah, so long term, I would ideally like to create an A2A disability community, just to kind of look and explore our church and ways that we can be a little more accessible, inclusive, and just thinking about these things, because it's not all about physical space. So definitely thinking a little bit more about just inclusive practices, a little bit more on the less physical end. And so I also, this isn't part of ATA's complete guide, but I would really like to do an inventory of needs. So basically some of the forms I found, what is it? One of the programs I found, it's not a UCC one officially, but basically we would be able to just like hand these out or keep them at like the info desk. And so basically if a person like wanted to, like, basically they could say like, hi, I have a, like, on this piece of paper anonymously say, I have this kind of disability. Can you, like, it's checklist. So like, can you provide this support? Or because a lot of times people with disabilities and their families, they just kind of are kind of invisible, because most people with disabilities, you can't really see them. And so we don't think about them that often. We don't think about the space as being accessible enough, because it works for us. So why doesn't work for everyone else? And as you age, needs change. So just taking inventory of all the people in our churches and what their needs are and families' needs, we can see, like, does a family need extra support, like getting transportation for their kid, or their kid with a disability, or their adult with a disability, or is there, because there's a lot of things most people just kind of be complacent on, and they're just like fine with, and they just kind of accept, and like in general. So our church can be accessible to the point of being inclusive, and reaching out to the people with disabilities in our community who might need the support inside and in their everyday life. Since I know we have some resources, everyone has a few resources we could share. And we never know, we don't know. Some of the people, like caregivers who stay at home, who can't come to church, may need the extra support, but they may be too shy to share it. And so A2A has they broke it up to a few different pieces of things they think are important. And I was like, these are actually really good ideas. So they're broken up into a few different sections. First is inclusion through leadership. So they highly recommend training in disability awareness. I know several different companies, Easter Seals would be willing to do it. And there are some other programs that would be willing to do it. So just for all of the leaderships, we are aware, because, if you don't have a specific disability, or if you do have a disability, but you don't know about other disabilities, then there might be some talent, like you might not be aware of it. I come from the IDD, or intellectual and developmental disability community, but recently I've been learning about chronic pain and how that is a disability and that hinders it. So finding and bridging that in between for what your disability, for people with a disability, and other people. Accessible communication is a huge one they push. We actually do a pretty good job of it, of having our little loop for hearing, for hard of hearing people. They just highly recommend that. They as a fun fact, they recommend putting ASL, basically just finding a person who has finding an ASL interpreter and saying, hey, if we need you in the future, we just want to know your rates, so that if we do need you in the future, we can contact you. And then we can kind of advertise that as being part of like our service. So maybe in the future, if a person who is deaf or hard of hearing would like to come to our church and they see that we have signing available, we can provide that if needed. I recommended having an inclusion team. So basically, just having a group of people that meet, talk about inclusion, and talk about our space and ways to improve. Hoping to do that. And then they find it really, really important to advertise that inclusive and what accommodations that we provide. So not just like keeping our ramp in the back, a ramp for our our ramp to the middle of our I don't know, dude, I'm just losing words today. Keeping our little ramp that goes up to the to the middle of our building. Where the pastor stands. I'm just like not doing good with words today. Anyway, so keeping that space, so keeping all of our accessible things out and like visuals. I like how we have our this is a service we provide for hard of hearing people sign. But also just like keeping it advertised everywhere so that everyone's aware of what kind of things we have. So a lot of times with people with disability, they just don't want to ask because they're like, it's fine. I can technically be a part of this. Or like offering an inclusive Bible when we do have Bible studies, just bringing it out when we bring out the other Bibles. Or if you like are keep an inclusive Bible on the shelf so a person can pick it up and see, oh, this is a thing. So just keep everything visible just in case. And everyone might learn something by being aware and seeing all of these disability things. And so the big one they highlighted was inclusion through attitudes. A ramp is not enough. Reverend Howard White. This is kind of his big thing. Just because you have a ramp doesn't mean your space is inclusive and completely accessible. And so again, they really push for inclusion training to create an inclusive environment. Just having talks about this of different ways we can be inclusive and things that we might not think about. And then I highly recommend reading a few books about people with disabilities or just Christianity and people with disabilities. I have a few good books that are pretty light reads that I recommend just as a way to start thinking about this. Because if we don't think about it, then it's not there. It just doesn't become part of our memory. We just kind of forget this minority exists. And then build in training for disability awareness for all volunteers. So like we have like our annual trainings we do. So we could probably add a slide about inclusive practices and ways we can be inclusive for people for kids with disabilities. Just include that into our trainings a little bit, just as a way to be aware and be supportive, because working with kids with disabilities is a lot harder than it looks. So just starting, you think it's intuitive, but it's a lot harder than you think. So just thinking of writing away a few ways potential ways that a person, teacher can help out a person with a disability and a kid with a disability. Inclusive practices, just writing them out, and so that we have a good place to start. And then lastly, communication. Communication. We have done a pretty good job of this, but I wanted to leave it in here because it is super important for everyone. And it is the first step, So like I mentioned before, scheduling in, like being able to know how to schedule an ASL interpreter. And so when we do advertise, we do ASL services. Just contact us if you would like that. Just so in the future, if we do have a person who is deaf and would like to come to our church, they can do that. I kind of pull these straight from the A2A. Accessible technology. So it also can include basically just keeping like a little whiteboard for someone who may not be as verbal. yeah. So if a person like doesn't really like, a lot of people who have problems with auditory processing need to see stuff written out. So just writing stuff out, or if you're like in the welcome center, like, yeah, write it out on a whiteboard so that they can see it as well. And just like having like little things, just having it available is the first step. Um, yeah. And so lastly, supporting people with disabilities as a congregation. Something really fun that I found is a lot of churches who are already physically accessible spaces, they like to go a step further. So by addressing some of the disability concerns in like the people with disabilities in our community as well. So the first one is employment programs. There's actually this really cool, really comprehensive program and study I looked into. Well, actually, I kind of found it. Basically, where churches are connecting people with disabilities to employment. Like basically, yeah, just employment using yeah, using their resources, each individual person's, oh, I'm losing words today. Yeah, resources, and being able to help people with disabilities find connections with jobs that they might be interested in. Because a lot of times people with disabilities, employment is super, super hard. And so if your family doesn't have a broad connection, being like, hey, I know this person who has a job opening. I can help you and work with them to contact them, and we can work together and see if this might be a good fit for you. Just as a member of a congregation, if you have a connection, thinking about that. And this is a really comprehensive, like 50-page thing. But yeah, employment is a huge thing, and keeping employment and being supportive of people with disabilities who are employed, because a lot of times they don't drive. So being aware of being able to offer them to drive them like once in a blue moon can oftentimes mean the world to them, because then they yeah because usually the caregivers are the ones who are taking them, which is, I found this is a common issue with a lot of caregivers, is yeah, just feeling overwhelmed, especially with taking care of an adult person with a disability. Um, yeah, supporting the caregivers is kind of a big one, but not just with employment, but in general. A lot of times they won't ask for help, even if, because unlike having like a child sick in the hospital where everyone's aware of it, we know how to support. But long term, these people just need someone to appear at their doorstep with like, or say like bring them up and say, "Hi, I have a casserole. I'm bringing it over," and like it can mean the world. It means that they like the parent can get like 1 hour of rest or something, because yeah, it's just one of those things. It's basically just um, immense pressure on like a totally another level. And by supporting caregivers, or just offering them, say like, hey, do you want to come to the mall with me, or do you want to go out to lunch with me, to any overwhelmed caregiver can mean the world, because a lot of times they're just struggling. And so as a next step we could do is we can help support the caregivers in our community. Actually know of a lot of caregivers in our community that are struggling. And so just like little things, and a lot of times they won't ask for help. So by just supporting them, and like it can mean the world, because yeah. And then yeah, transportation, as I mentioned before, because the transportation system here for most people with disabilities in Colorado is not great. It's really bad. And a lot of people will not be able to, like the service we have, Accessoride, barely runs, and you will oftentimes be late. So a lot of times people just won't go out. And yeah, so yeah, we could start. But yeah, if you have a car and you have a few hours, you'd be like, hey, do you need a ride somewhere, to a person with a disability or their caregiver? And they would most likely take you up on that offer, because it's one of those little things that means the world to them. Yeah. And so to wrap up, I want to include this little quote from Reverend Howard White, which is, proclaim the message of inclusion in all of the language of today's means, using braille or large print for people with visual disabilities, signing or special sound systems for people with hearing disabilities, image, color, and drama for people with cognitive disabilities, architectural access and for people with physical disabilities or who are getting older. Let the stone be rolled away and let the glorious message be proclaimed truly in all of the languages and all of the different meanings. So all they hear and understand. Yeah. And then here are some further recommended readings I recommend you read. They're not too long and they're not really boring reads. I highly recommend starting with Disabled God. It's a super great starter book for disability and the world. Yeah. Here's some sources and thank you.
So are there any questions from anyone here or on the Zoom meeting or comments?
Yeah,
Jerry?
Krista, thank you. That was really terrific. The A2A brochure, which I find just quickly reading it pretty amazing. Is that been distributed anywhere in our church, or is this a brand new something?
A2A is the UCC's overarching program, and so they have a whole bunch of resources. They don't have a lot of churches that identify as A2A, so I just kind of pulled from there and was like, this is a great place to start because a lot of times, yeah, we just don't know. So I pulled the brochure because it's just a lot of the things I talked about, generalized, and just things to think about.
But is it being distributed within our church in any way that you?
Oh, I can definitely get that distributed. Yeah. Yeah, this is kind of the first step. But yeah, I can definitely do that.
Excellent.
Larry?
Rihanna has one.
You're muted. You're muted.
You're muted.
You're muted.
So what am I supposed to do?
Can you unmute?
There you go, okay. Nope, still can't hear it.
Do you want to like type it in the chat?
We can't hear you.
Yeah. Technology.
Turn it up, turn the volume up, Brianna.
Maybe.
I can't do it on this end, I don't think. Yeah.
Can you type your question in the chat?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe you could type your question in the chat. We can't hear you. So did somebody else have a question here? Larry?
Krista, do you know if we have things like the A2A brochure on a bulletin board in the church?
Nope. Yeah, we don't have any A2A things at all in our church. So I
Okay.
wanted to, yeah, just start that. Yeah, it is connected to WISE, but we have a lot of WISE stuff, but not a lot of A2A stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I definitely want to start that. They have quite a few good things to read. Just, fun facts.
So I was, Krista and I were talking before this session. So I think me personally, and I think from the medical field, we kind of have a couple of implicit biases about people that have disabilities. So one of the implicit biases that we have is that disability should be fixed. That's what we do in medicine. But I think a really kind of interesting example that I observed years ago. So there's this thing, short stature, so there are kids that are born that are short, and they're going to be short as adults. And there are many studies to show that there are advantages to being tall. On average, taller people make more money. They have more higher positions in organizations. So many parents stress out if they think their kid is going to be 4'11" or 4'10", and you can fix that by giving your kids growth hormone. So there's this whole industry on trying to correct short stature in children by giving growth hormone. And so I had this this patient, and she had short stature, and the parents were giving her growth hormone. She hated it. And she finally said, "Mother, I want you to love me for who I am. I don't care whether I'm 4'11" or 5'8". Just love me for who I am." So I think there is this bias we have in medicine and sometimes in society that we ought to fix these disabilities. And I think that was an example for me. I think there's one other bias that we have in medicine. I think it's probably in the general population as well. There are many studies that have been done where they ask a healthcare worker, a doctor or a nurse, when they had a patient that was in a hospital with a disability, can you, how would you rate this person's quality of life on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 100? And then they would ask the patient, how would you rate your own quality of life? And healthcare workers tend, almost all the studies show the healthcare workers tend to rate the perceived quality of life less than the person actually judges their own quality of life. So we value intelligence, we value mobility, we value the ability to speak well. Most people in healthcare are well educated, and they have this intrinsic bias that those things have to be important to somebody else for them to value life. So I think just being aware of sort of those, and we have this implicit bias training that we give medical students, and those are a couple of things we emphasize, that some people may not want to be fixed. There may be people that are okay with being 4'11", and that you need to be careful about having this implicit judgment of what somebody else's quality of life is. So anyway, Krista, any comments about that, or?
Oh, it is a huge thing in the disability community. The medicalization of disability. A lot of times, it's just, it's a disability can be like part of your identity for a lot of people with disabilities, who like specific disabilities who identify as disabled. It is their identity. They don't want to be fixed. That's what the book Disabled God highlights. But it also like depends on the person. So like Eric's friend, his mentor, actually I've been talking to. She's one of the first disability scholars. She actually wrote a piece arguing with that. And so for her, she has chronic pain. So for her, she's like grappling with, do I not take medication for it? But also, do I like take medication for it but it's part of my identity. So like grappling with those issues, a lot of times it's not just like the medical community, just people just in general struggle with it. Also the healing aspect brings me to disability theology, where it's just healing in the Bible, where like they're just like heal the people, and like you didn't ask to be healed. Why am I being healed? Maybe I was happy living as a blind person. Like, did you know during the time of when Jesus was alive, blind people were, because there was, people were being blinded just out of like military issues. They would basically, it was, you will have a job and you will live your life as a normal person, just no vision. So that was like kind of like not even it wasn't considered that big of a disability in the disability like comparison world. And so the healing was, maybe it was part of that person's identity, or just there is just a lot of things like that in the Bible.
Krista, Brianna typed in she has one question I can answer. She says, what does A2A stand for? And it's accessible to all. Accessible to all, Brianna. But she has this other comment. She said, a concern of mine about our church is that the platform and choir loft are not accessible to those in wheelchairs or using walkers. Maybe we should work on that.
Oh yeah,
What do you-
and the fact there are stairs in the back. And yeah, there's oh gosh, yeah, I feel that. Yeah, that's definitely something I definitely want to address. Just even, yeah, just putting in a little ramp or something, or yeah, just even like a little wooden block that like so people can get
This
up
one?
that.
Okay.
Yeah, because it is, yeah, that's one of the things that's on the A2A checklist is talking about choir spaces. Because yeah, that hinders people from being part of the choir who just may use a walker or something.
Well, that's something to think about.
Saw a lot of walkers at church this morning. I was
Yes,
kind of surprised.
I-
hadn't
yeah,
noticed
I
before.
saw that
Yeah.
too, yeah.
I don't know how many years ago it was that we didn't have any accessible seats, but I remember the process we went through. People in the back, they had to sit in the back in their wheelchairs because they couldn't sit any further
Right,
in the church.
yes,
And it was like a big deal to get it to where they could come down and sit. And now it is quite common,
right,
to see, and it's wonderful. And people probably stayed in the church who would not have
right.
otherwise.
Otherwise, yeah,
But it was an adjustment in attitude
right,
for businesses. Being a business owner myself, the ramp takes up a lot of space when you're putting it into a building, and it's hard to want to do that. So it's an adjustment to your middle, and then when it's done, it just feels so right.
Right.
And then it, one step further, but
Yeah.
always more to do.
Yeah, it seemed to me we have more patience with these disabilities that are a consequence of aging, with mobility and
Uh-huh.
hearing and even vision things. And I think many of us feel more uncomfortable around so children that have cerebral palsy, that have these constant movement disorders, or even people that stutter, so we have a president that stutters, right?
Yeah.
And you can see people are impatient, can't you just spit it out? People are impatient with that, and they sort of misinterpret what it is. They misinterpret it as a cognitive problem as opposed to a stuttering problem. So I think those other kinds of disabilities, there seems like we're, again, it's just sort of an implicit discomfort or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's an
Excuse me, you know what I've heard of the president? This is, I don't know, sure, I don't know, he doesn't move his mouth when he talks.
Oh.
Have you ever heard of that?
So I mean,
You know, people watch your mouth when you talk, or you can't hear
Right.
real well.
right,
I'm not saying it, that's the way
right.
So if you're reading,
I think it's amazing that he does as well as he does. I mean, the guy can whole paragraphs, and most people that stutter can't do nearly as well as our president does. And, he has actually been pretty transparent about that, so.
that probably helps him.
Yeah.
The fact that he doesn't have to worry about people finding out, or,
Mhm.
I think that's really, so much of the problem, especially early on when kids stutter, they don't want to talk at all.
Right. They're embarrassed, and people make fun of them, or
Yeah.
people are impatient with them.
Right.
Yeah, so. Well, any other, Judith?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
yes,
Okay. I am differently abled myself and using a walker. I did serve as a liturgist at church on the when we were doing the treehouse services. And they placed me on the floor beside the platform. So it was fine. It was great. But I felt somewhat different because I was unable to get up on the platform. Just listening to Krista as hearing your comments, I felt that I needed to let you know how I felt about that. It would be nice to have. I love doing liturgy. I've been doing somewhat ministry, most of my life, and it would be nice to have that available so I wouldn't be feeling different.
Is there another comment?
And I appreciate your comments. Thank you so much.
Oh, two.
Jan?
I think that one of the areas that most of us have less knowledge and maybe more apprehension or discomfort is in the area of what's called now neurodiversity. And I mean, I admit my lack of I don't want to say comfort level, but just my lack of sort of knowing the best ways to bring people out and interact. And I just wanted to mention that our, one of our new members, Reverend Amy Petrie Hill, is she sitting there?
Amy's here.
Oh. I think we're really fortunate to have Amy, and I think that over, taking these kinds of considerations into mind and looking for sort of leadership and new ideas, that Amy is going to be a wonderful resource and guide for us. So, hi, Amy. Thank you. You're not on my screen.
And huge kudos though to Krista, right? Because it's one thing if somebody's a little specialist over here, or for a doctor, or whatever, it's something else for someone who has family members or is working to educate themselves and speak witness into the church. So I just want to haul that up. Changes happen when people like Krista do this, right?
Yep.
So all praise and love. What an awesome presentation.
Amy, do you have any comments about what's happening kind of at a state level or conference level with the UCC or?
Sure.
Well, now you have an organization.
Sure. So I'll just speak around IDD and intellectual and developmental disability, and I'm going to move over here.
Sure.
I'm not trying to hide, I just came in late, so I was preaching in another church. Okay. So one of the things that we have in Colorado, there's a couple of different things. One is there's not enough money and enough resources for adults who want to live as independently as possible to do so. And people either end up, like Krista was talking about, in institutions, which is not where we want people if they don't want to be there. Right. So people either have to stay at home or they're in these group homes rather than maybe in a host home where they live with a family that's not their family. So there's more independence. They get to kind of make their own way. And the other thing is at the intersection of mental health and intellectual and developmental disabilities. We don't have enough. This training really isn't provided to mental health professionals. So if you happen to have more than one different ability, sometimes you can't find anyone to support you and give you the care you need either as a child or as a young adult or as an adult. And this idea, and Krista was talking about it on her slide, right? We're not just in these little categories. Maybe we have a mobility issue and that may impact our mental health, which impacts our employment. So we're these holistic, wonderfully created children of God. And a lot of our policies don't maybe look at people that way, which is where I think the church and people like Krista can really be leaders, because we're the ones that are saying, no, they're whole beings, they're made in the image of God. That's not always how policy works. That's a little general, but I also trust Krista to tell us some of the places that we should be examining in our church and maybe in the legislature too.
Oh, yeah. I love how you're just scratch the surface. Yeah, but as a church, we can do a lot to just support these people with disabilities and like fill in for those lack of services, especially with transportation and even if it isn't quite housing, just being supportive, like as trying to give independence to these people and to these families of people with disabilities and just, yeah, create a little bit of independence. Yeah, we have, that would be like, that's like long term, but yeah, there is a lot that we can do, but there's also a lot that needs to be done.
Well, any other questions or? Thank you very much for your attendance today. Krista, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy college schedule. I hope we didn't, and presenting today when you had the scratchy throat, you did great. We really appreciate it. So next week, Adult Forum is about the Afghan refugee situation in Denver. So somebody from Lutheran Family Services will be presenting. So tune in next week. Krista, again, thank you. Thank you very much. So.
There was a chat. So I think we should stop the recording. Yeah.